You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast with Brian Wood and myself, Mike Klein, and tonight we are joined by Dr. Guy Jodarski, who is a staff veterinarian with Organic Valley, and also Kevin Kino, who is a divisional pool manager for Organic Valley, works in the field with farmers and staff in the Midwest and Mideast regions. So thank you, Dr. Guy and Kevin, for joining us tonight.
You're welcome, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having us.
So how long have you been with Crop Organic Valley?
It's been right about 10 years now because I started in early 2008, basically working as a contractor, helping Dr. Paul do meetings and working with a few farms that were having trouble. And so it was a part-time thing, but it developed into full-time work and actually became an employee in 2011. So officially, I've been an employee for 7 years, but I started basically 10 years ago.
And you were a practicing veterinarian leading into that contract work?
Yeah, so I've been a veterinarian for 30 years. We just had our 30-year reunion for vet school, and I didn't continuously go right from conventional practice into Organic Valley. I did a few other things in industry for a few years in between, but I had a conventional dairy practice, so as a partner with other people. There were four of us that were partners, and we had a busy practice in central Wisconsin, mostly dairy practice. I did that for 12 years.
Was there any exposure to organics in that practice?
It was very limited, and it wasn't very positive because we had one organic farmer, and it wasn't the best farmer, and in a way it almost looked like he was going backwards because it was a herd that had really nice cows and good production, and they had gone, the production went down and so forth, and in the end this farm was not a good example because it was an integrity issue, and he actually, after several years of being organic, was no longer allowed to be organic. So it wasn't a real good example. But that was really the first exposure. But he was an Organic Valley member, and the interesting thing was it was back in the days when they was kind of the last on, first off, and he was one of the last ones on. So he was on and off organic, and so it really seemed it wasn't very consistent. It wasn't very dependable at that point, in time. Mm-hmm. And the only other exposure I had was, I grew up in high school in the 70s, and so there was all this counterculture movement, young people protesting and all that, and organic seemed to grow out of rebellion and a lot of back to land people that, and so it just seemed associated with that crowd of people. So that was kind of where I came from as far as, knowing anything about organic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So were you intrigued at all with the movement through the 70s, the organic movement? Did you look into that for your practice, or was it just something that you developed later?
Yeah, I developed it later because really not much about it. I really didn't know much about alternative medicine or anything at that point, and it was a later thing. As far as looking at the organic movement or looking at just the rebellion of the 70s and stuff, it was a real interesting time because as I was a young person, it was during the Vietnam War and so forth, and basically a very divisive time in the country, and so that was a real interesting growing up. My father was he was a deputy sheriff, and he was kind of conservative, and he really he had his opinions about people with long hair and rebellions and all that, and so it was quite a counterculture. But the one thing that really did attract me about organic, and just thinking about organic, is I always really had a strong feeling about environmental issues. And so the 70s were, as you remember, were a real important time for the Clean Water Act and all the things, the awareness of pollution, the littering, all that stuff. And so the environment, Earth Day came into being, and so I always felt very strongly about nature and taking care of the earth, and so that part of the organic really did appeal. But the alternative medicine thing really came much later.
Mm-hmm. So did you mentioned Dr. Paul, and Dr. Paul in organics is kind of, would he be considered the godfather of vets within the organic movement? kind of the first one to really talk about it and get it into the mainstream?
Well, in a lot of ways, that's true. Dr. Paul, was one of my first contacts, and he definitely was a trailblazer, and he did develop a lot of techniques and tools and things like that. There were others, I think maybe Dr. Karaman, who's not nearly as old, but he was from the veterinary community side. Dr. Karaman had much more interplay with the academic veterinarians and so forth. And so for bringing organic awareness to the general public, Karaman was probably as important or more important, where Paul was really very important in developing organic health practices with the farmers directly, but not so much in the veterinary community.
Interesting. So was on the farm, okay, as your practice was going along, did you start having more and more farmers thinking about going to organics, and that kind of helped you shift that way because of the need, or the farmers asking for the help from the organic side?
Well, not really, because what happened is when I was in conventional practice, like I said, there was only this one guy that was organic and very little interest in organic at that time. And so the thing about the time I was in practice, which was 1987 through 99, that time period saw a lot of stress on small family farms, small dairy farms, and they were very numerous at that time. We had, in the place where I practiced, we had over 400 clients, and our radius was only 15 miles. That took about 90% of our clients. So there were anywhere from 5 to 8 veterinarians in our practice. So we were, very busy in a small area. That's the density of the farms that there were probably many areas across the country that were like that. And so the thing that really discouraged me, two things. One thing was we treated the same thing over and over. There were displaced abomasum surgeries, and that's basically from cows not getting fed correctly, and milk fever from not feeding dry cows correctly. We did those things over and over, and we really attempted to teach farmers that they could prevent these problems. And in some ways, we were pretty good at treating those things, and so a lot of farmers didn't, and we were economical. The return on having the vet fix a DA or treat a milk fever was pretty good, and so the farmers were content to not prevent problems, and that was a frustrating thing. But the most frustrating thing was how the really good farmers that we had saw no future in their farming. Their 50, 60 cow dairies, they saw no future there, and they were actively discouraging their children from even considering being part of the farm. They were telling them to get an education and get out of here. And I don't know, Kevin, you probably experienced some of that, in your community too. But that's to me, that was the most discouraging thing, is that there wasn't a future for the young people.
Yeah, it was very common in our area for that. Just an example, when I went to high school in the late 70s, most of the classes in school at that time were made up of kids that were from dairy farms in the area. When my children went to school, I think in my older daughter's class there was one other person that was from a dairy. In my younger daughter's class, there were 2 people in the class that were from dairy farms. So just from one generation to the next, the change was just almost unbelievable.
And I think, one of the things that intrigues us about working with organics is seeing that farm being able to stay in business, that small family farm being able to stay in business. And one of the big concerns when transitioning over to organic is always animal health. And what am I going to do if I don't have those antibiotics, or I don't have, what's my milk production going to do if I'm not feeding as much grain as I did when I was conventional? And so just going back to one of the things you mentioned about when you were in conventional practice, doing that prevention measures and feeding properly and feeding dry cows properly. And now you've come back almost full circle to that, now working today with these organic farmers. And let's just kind of get into what you've seen and learned over these, 11 years working with Organic Valley, and just working with organic farmers in general, and seeing the learning curve, I guess, of a organic farmer from start to, 5 years down the road of learning these prevention measures and not seeing the vet come on the farm and that being a positive thing.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought of it before, but just listening to you guys, talk about that, and Dr. Paul again, bringing him back in, what am I going to do with my cows when something happens? What am I going to do? And one of the things that Dr. Paul Detloff really was good at was developing alternative treatments. And so he developed a whole rash of treatments and a whole arsenal of things to do and treat with, and for infections instead of antibiotics, for cows that were having reproductive problems to overcome that. And those were all kind of the common things where you used a lot of drugs in practice. So my first exposure to organic was not with Organic Valley. I actually worked for a company that made products, and Dr. Paul was part of that company. And so that's kind of how I met him. And so my learning curve was very similar to the farmers, which I'd never had this thought before. But my learning curve was, what do you use instead of? What do I use? No, I can't use a prostaglandin shot, a lutolized shot for a cow that was not cycling. What do I use for a cow with a cough and pneumonia that needs an antibiotic? And I learned about garlic, and I learned about aloe vera, and that was all Dr. Paul's, development. But over time, it became apparent, even working in that realm, that, boy, we could make more progress by keeping animals healthy in the first place. And so we really didn't need that stuff. And so at first, and I think it's a trend that a lot of new organic farmers, and it's almost overwhelming, learning the alternative medicines. And I tell organic farmers now to not worry or concentrate so much on learning about all these tinctures or homeopathy or whatever alternative medicines, is really build a healthy system. And so over time, it just became real apparent that grazing animals, and a high forage diet, less grain in the diet, simple things, good mineralization of the feed, good nutrition, good low stress handling of animals, good facilities, all those things could basically prevent problems. And then as I got to know more organic farmers, we saw farmers who just had very little need for any kind of treatments. And so, I imagine, Kevin, you probably had a real development over time when you became an organic farmer, as far as that whole scene, and probably maybe started off with some of those treatments and found out you didn't need as many as time went on.
Yeah, it was interesting through the transition. My history when I was younger was very type A, very competitive. I believe at one point we had the second or third highest herd average in the county, in a county where there was probably 4 dairies that were selling bulls to stud. And when I made the decision to make the change, at that time with the high production, we were having metabolic issues, cystic ovaries, trouble breeding, the things that you mentioned earlier with DAs, ketosis, and that, and some other issues. And then as we transitioned away from it, slowly we saw them go away. But, at that time there was nothing. So this was 22 plus years ago. And I really relied on my dad, who had grown up in a depression on a dairy farm, and he also dairy farmed before. He can remember a time where we didn't even have penicillin. So they had to be very self-sufficient. So it really relied on my dad and just asking questions. And really, most of the problems with the cattle went away. And you are correct. I had, on the front end, I had what there was, which wasn't much. And, by the time we were 5-6 years into it, literally maybe had 2 things, maybe 3 things, and almost never used anything. It was just astonishing. The had for the organic community, still had relatively high production, but really had very little trouble with the cattle. When I had the high production, I think I was doing herd health probably twice a month, preg checks, treating cows for whatever it was at that time, and then backed off to once a month, and then every other, and then ended up regressing to twice a year, just because there wasn't anything to treat. So basically, I had the vet in to do vaccinations on calves and cows and dehorning, and just some of the things I didn't want to do. So that's kind of where I ended up.
Mm-hmm. It's always kind of fun watching these new farmers to organic. And as you mentioned, not much was available when you transitioned. What was that, 95?
Yeah, I went on the truck on 95, so I would have been transitioning 3 years prior.
Sure. And, you go to trade shows and you see publications, and the amount of things available to today's organic farmers is tremendously beyond what was around when you were transitioning. But you talk to these farmers that have been around for, just 5 years now. When they transitioned, they were very concerned, just as you mentioned. What do I do to replace this thing that I was using in a conventional system? I don't know how I'm going to farm without it. And 5 years down the road, you talk to them again, and that's not even on their radar. I mean, they maybe have a medicine cabinet with a few things that, just in case something goes off the rails, they've got it around. But as far as, having a medicine list and going through how they take care of problems, I mean, they're saying, well, I just don't have the problems.
Right.
It's a whole system change. I guess I look at it as in humans, you talk about holistic medicine or holistic health and prevention, and it's no different in the cattle. It's changing the diet, changing the amount of nutrients in your feed or in our food or the feed.
Right.
And one thing leads to the other.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting when you see that with young farmers, because like you mentioned, Brian, and Dr. Guy, you too, how you use this tool. Now you've got to find the organic alternative to that tool, and how much treatment stuff is bought early on.
Right.
And then 5 years down the road, I mean, I can name 2 products that people have. Mm-hmm. And that is both are actually Dr. Paul's products, CEG and Dullet, because Dullet for pain relief.
Yep.
And that's kind of it. And it's really exciting because the farmers are noticing how easy prevention is.
Right.
When you take away these simple treatment options, you have no choice but to look at the prevention. So when you go to the prevention, they're taking it all the way back to the soil.
Yes.
Because that's where it starts. Because if you have a healthy soil, your end product and the human being is going to be healthier all the way through.
Right.
And that's what gets me excited, is when farmers see that connection. And I think you've had a lot to do with it, with making people understand that your herd health does not start when you feed that cow in the barn. It starts when you get that feed from the field. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, the soil is the foundation, there's no doubt. And it just reminds me of Wendell Berry and his famous book, what's it called, about the farm people leaving?
Unsettling of America.
Unsettling of America. The Unsettling, a classic, almost like Aldo Leopold's
Sand County Almanac.
Yeah, Sand County Almanac, yeah. And so the Unsettling of America has a pretty good section in there about health. And Wendell Berry explains how the word health itself comes from a family of words that are whole and wholesome and holy and hallow. And what health ultimately means is everything together. And so what you pointed out, Mike, is true, is that the soil is the foundation of health for the plants, for the animals, for the people. And, now in this time of climate change, we know when we have good farming practices, another great thing about the soil is it can be our place to put the carbon can be built up, and that actually builds more health because it builds more life in the soil, and then everything's healthier because of it. So it is exciting. It really is exciting because it makes a difference. It makes a difference because we help family farms stay in business. We give a future. We help. It's not just us, but it's all of us working together, and that's a neat thing too, is building the community. But we have opportunities for the next generation. We're helping clean up the world. We're helping with the climate issues. It's what better job could we have? The teamwork that we get to do working with so many good people.
when I think one of the ideas you touched on there is, it's a system of farming.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of whether it's farmers or consumers or whoever, they think organic is just a list of things and practices or ideas or I don't know what the right word, I'm searching for the right word here, but just a list of things you need to follow, and you then get certified and you have a certificate. It's much, much more than that. And trying to explain that to people is sometimes an uphill battle until they see it happen.
Yeah.
And once they see it happen and they see the system of like you said, starting with the soil, and then it just all builds from there.
Yeah.
And having that idea in place is, I think, the key behind it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when you first start talking to farmers about organics, they're very conventional minded.
Yeah.
The first things they talk about is what they're not allowed to use.
Yeah.
It's I can't have this, I can't do that. Yeah. What am I going to do here? And it's not a practice of what you can't use.
Yeah.
It's about what you can do.
Right.
So it's just the perspective.
Yep.
Once that perspective shifts, and we've seen farmers come to organics strictly for the economics of it.
Yeah.
And then to see that shift into believing and feeling good about what they're doing takes about 3 years. And then you really start to see it manifest.
Yeah, I really think what, I maybe I look at it a little different perspective, but I agree with you 100%, Mike. But it's really a shift in consciousness. I think, for most producers, not so much the organic producers, because they have that shift of consciousness, but when I work with conventional farmers, in recruitment or friends of mine, there's really, they don't seem to be completely conscious that what they're producing is food. It's a commodity that pays the bills. The milk leaves the farm, and there's no more thought beyond that. And I think when a producer goes through the transition, sees the changes in the cattle, the soil, healthiness of the animals, it really changes their consciousness. And I think that feeds into their success as well, because you become more in harmony. You know that you're producing food that people's children are going to consume, and just really being more aware of what's going on around you. And it just gets easier and easier as you go through. I have seen some producers that really don't make that full transformation, but I believe that the people that do are the ones that really excel. And it's undeniable that you change practices on a farm, and we talked about here about being proactive, changing systems rather than treating symptoms. And when somebody becomes totally aware of what they're doing on the farm, to the land, to the animals, to themselves, ultimately, you really see the consciousness shift, and they become aware of what's going on around them, become more observant, really become part of the system. So even we talk a lot about the animals in the soil, but the human element also has to be part of the system.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's what holistic thinking is all about. And you point out the consciousness, that's critical, and that just, it's all about realizing the connections. All the connections, that what you do on your farm affects, what goes on downstream. It affects you and your health and all the people that are eating the food, and ultimately the world. And so, that whole idea of unity, and it goes back to that whole idea of health and wholeness. I mean, and what you guys said about, the no's in organic, that was where people start out, is what you can't do, the no's. And it's really not about the no's. It's about what we're really doing on the positive side, that what we're trying to do, the yeses, And so I think, that the one word as far as, using things, input substitution is the word I like to use. So, instead of penicillin, I'm going to use garlic. That's a different input. Or instead of, a weed killer, I'm going to use, to me, like somebody that sprays vinegar on a weed to kill it is really not much different than somebody using, an herbicide. And so really it's more questioning, why is the weed there? Why? What conditions bring the weed? What do we have to do with the minerals? What about other plants? All those kind of things, the connections.
I think John Kempf had a quote, if I can get it right. Instead of working under the warfare paradigm, you try to work in harmony with everything that's there.
That'd be the consciousness.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I probably butchered his quote, but I think you get the drift.
Oh, that's perfect. And really, we know chemical agriculture came out of a byproduct of the war, and that's where the chemicals came from. And I've heard it said that war is a mindset. And so when you have that mindset, that's the way you see things, and you see things in a conflict way, and that's the way you approach problems. And that's probably one of the biggest consciousness shifts a farmer has to make, is the problem-solving mode is different. It's not a war anymore. It's more of a dance, and so I think that's a real consciousness shift.
Well, that's bringing to mind two different people that I've seen speak, and then a video as well. Gabe Brown came to Michigan to talk a while ago, and he was talking about how he's a grazer out in North Dakota, and he grazes 30 different species of grasses and has really seen soil benefits. And he was a heavily conventional farmer, heavily conventional crop farming. And he just said he woke up one day and he's like, I'm just sick of killing things. Mm-hmm. How do I go about changing this? And that's when he brought animals to the farm, and he started planting different varieties of grasses, and all of a sudden, his entire environment surrounding him was changing. And then the other one that I was thinking of is, do you remember the video? It's called "A Million Beating Hearts."
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful video.
It is.
And it's a million.
100,000, I think.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
100,000 beating hearts.
Yeah. It's a fellow in the South that, and the interesting thing about that story is he talks about the rural America decline, and he takes you, actually takes you through a town with all the empty buildings and describes where the stores were, and now they're rebuilding that community. It's an awesome story.
Yeah, I actually retweeted the video on our Twitter page just to get it out there again, even though we're not probably moving the needle much with our social media presence. But when I watch that video, very seldom do I watch a YouTube video and you get like a little bit emotional. But I'm like, come on, Mike, why is this affecting you? But it is a beautiful thing. And I think what he's doing there on that farm is what we're trying to do as a cooperative within Organic Valley. We're trying to do this on a larger scale with more smaller farms. Because, with the next generation, if we don't save these farms for the next generation, I will feel like I failed. Because when I go on a farm and I do paperwork to transfer that farm to the next generation, I feel like we're doing what we need to do to save this family farm. Yeah. And that's why I do it.
Yeah.
I think we all have that in common, but as I get older and I'm around this longer, I think I'm in my 22nd year, with organic production and the co-op. Noticing I think when people think about the statement that you just made, Mike, that we're trying to save the small farm or make sure it's viable for the next generation. But what interests me a lot of times is, especially in the position I'm in now, where I don't work directly with farmers so much, but work with staff that work with farmers, is the subtleties. It's most of the time it's not a big act. It's not some big event that you do that saves a farm or something. It's some subtle little thing that you probably didn't realize at the time. And this goes back to awareness again. Because if you can start catching some of those things and understand what happened, I think you can replicate. But I think most of the time in most people's lives, whether it's what we do or a nurse in the hospital or something, it's usually something more obscure that you don't even realize you're passing on, and that really moves the dial. So it's really difficult to know what that is, but I think life is kind of designed that way. It's kind of like a mystery. But, I have seen over the years, I've seen things or have been around long enough where somebody will come back 3-4 years later and say, you remember when you said this? And I may not even remember it. But then they'll tell me how it completely changed their thinking. And at the time, I just had absolutely no idea. So it's just fascinating. People are fascinating. Why they do things is fascinating. So you just never know. So it's the details and not giving up and doing the little things. It's just like farming. It's the little things that make farms more efficient and soils better and cows more healthy. Walking through the barn and noticing an animal breathing a little heavier than she should be. 90% of the people never see that. But that can make a huge difference. It can stave off a pneumonia epidemic, by catching that one animal. And sometimes we'll never know these things, but I think that's where the importance lies. It's not in some big act. It's the things that we're not even aware that we're doing a lot of times.
And that's one thing that I think is so exciting with farming is so different than any other business because you're not necessarily in competition with other farmers. Because if you find an organic farmer that figured something out that works really well, he wants to tell the world. He doesn't want to keep this for his little secret because, wow, I really figured out how to keep my calves healthy. Mm-hmm. No, he wants to tell everybody because, hey, this works great. You might want to try it. And that's what I think is so exciting is to see these farmers take pride in helping other farmers to learn. We're all learning together. And to see these groups of farmers come together and just, like we're actually at the Indiana Grazing Conference and so to see these farmers, hundreds of farmers there, to learn and to help each other it's really inspiring.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the sharing and Kevin's talked about the awareness and the observation. I think I want to come back to that. But, this idea of learning from each other, I think that is a huge thing. And the openness and the willingness and the excitement about sharing, I think that's really what sets organic farming apart. It really is a contagious enthusiasm. People come to organic meetings, and if they're new to the organic, they're really surprised at the energy level. They're surprised at the positivity, the upbeat of the people, and so I think one of the things the group I work with, the Farm Resources Group, we really feel one of our big jobs is to go out and just see what's working on farms. And take that information from one farmer to another. So Logan Peterman was head of our department for a while, and he said part of your job is cross-pollination. You are the pollinators. You take the ideas from one farmer to another, and I think that's one of the things we always go into. It's really different than we think of other experts, extension people or experts and whatever, consultants and things, where they come out and prescribe what to do. Most of our job too is to go out to farms and be observant and see what's working or what's not working, and then take that to the other farmers. And so to me, somebody told me once that people are happiest when they're learning. And I am personally really happy working with farmers because I'm learning every day. And to take that to other people, it's really fun.
Well, and one thing, I think I heard it today in some conversation along the line, if you want to piss off a farmer, tell him what to do.
Yeah.
If you make a suggestion, it's completely different than that consultant or somebody stepping on the farm and saying, hey, buddy, here's how you need to do it, you big dummy.
Yeah.
That doesn't go over so well with a farmer.
Yeah.
But I think, Guy, that you're exactly right. We're on this farm, and we see something that's really neat. I get excited, and it never fails when you see something like that. Within a few days, a farmer's going to ask you a question that pertains to what you just learned,
right.
And then you can pass this information on because my thing is when I talk to a farmer, I try to always use other farmers that are doing it, because I am not milking cows.
Right.
I am not raising calves.
Right.
So don't take what I say as the truth or as the gospel truth and this is how you do it. This farmer can help you. You might want to talk to him about it. And I love how you said we're pollinators.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is we do.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. One of the other real important concepts is diversity. And diversity in nature is what gives nature strength and gives it resilience. It can come back when there's something that upsets it. It gives it resistance to disease, all those sort of things. But diversity is really important. And one of the exciting things about our work is we see a diversity of farms. And to me, it's nothing more constraining or frustrating than having a cookbook method of doing something, and having what's called best practices that we always do it this way. And so the beauty of organic farming is you have to do it different on every farm. And not only that, you do it different on the same farm in different years. And so it's part of that being in touch and adjusting. But that could sound pretty chaotic. It could be like, there's nothing holding this together. But really, what we're about, what we really need to learn about is to identify the principles that underlie things. And so what I mean by that is, like, a cow needs a high forage diet. That's a principle. And so we don't violate that principle. We don't overfeed grain to cows. Now, how we feed that high forage diet, the forages in North Carolina are going to be very different than the forages in Minnesota, but yet they still have to be on a high forage diet. So I think a lot of what we do is identifying the principles and then seeing the practices that vary by farm and by region, and then learning the lessons and just trying to develop and refine those principles.
Yeah, I think it's amazing when you look at the diversity on our farms, from just geographical diversity, because we talked at dinner tonight with Chris Hoffner and Sam Dobson, who we had a chance to sit down with and on the podcast. But they're in North Carolina. Chris is further south than Sam. Sam is a lot cooler because he's up toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's, I don't know, what is it, maybe 20 miles, I don't remember. But it's not that far, but there's a difference there. And you take trying to raise row crops with Johnson grass everywhere in North Carolina, and then you go all the way up to northern Minnesota. Like, it is a huge difference, yet the practice of feeding the cows is the same.
Right.
And how you have to adapt that practice with all these different soil types to make it work. It's pretty neat, because I like to see the farmers from different regions learn something, because regionally, kind of set in your ways. Mm-hmm. But bringing other regions in, that's why I think it's so important for our farmers to connect with farmers from different climates and different regions to learn.
Yep. And I think, just back to one of the things you mentioned, Dr. Guy, was it can seem chaotic on the surface. And I think that's one of the big fears when a conventional farmer starts looking at organic. It's such a wide-ranging, there's so many different ways to get to success. And they haven't, I guess the way I see it is part of the reason that GMOs and sprays became so prevalent is because it made farming easy. You just simply, you plant in the spring, you spray in the summer, and you harvest in the fall.
Yep.
It made things very easy, and you listen to the co-op on what NP and K levels you need to be at. And then you look at organic, and as we've been talking about this whole time, it's a whole system. And then these conventional farmers that may be used to that system may get fearful that, hey, this looks too much. It's too much. I'm not going to be able to take it all in. Yeah. But in all reality, it really is a simplistic, if you boil it down to the basics, like you said, the principles,
right, then
it becomes a whole lot easier. And it really is, it can be that easy if you let it.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the mindset and how you have to problem solve differently, but I think another way you can say it is that we have to be less controlling. And people are really into control. and part of industrial systems are all about control, and industrial farming is all about control, and so part of the uncomfortable nature of this fluidness and responding and not having a set agenda is that we don't have control. And I think grazing is a really good example of that, where people that haven't grazed before have a hard time because they really like to control the feed. There's a lot of science that says I need to feed this level of these different nutrients, and I can have a computer make a ration and I can feed it to my cows. And if the milk in the tank, of the bulk tank, changes a few pounds, I better be readjusting my scale weights of different feed ingredients. And it's all about control. When you turn the cows loose and let them eat, then it's a very loose control. I mean, you can put them in paddocks, and sometimes you give them too much, sometimes you don't give them enough, and you learn and you respond, and it's a whole different approach. And so and as humans, we have to let go of some of the control, and that's the interplay with nature. That's really, to me, that's more the organic approach.
I think it's interesting, because I think you're exactly right. But the older I get and the longer I'm around this business, the more I realize we don't control anything. Yeah. and it is you talked about principles, and that those are very important because it sets the mark. And then after that, it's a systems approach.
Yeah.
So and what's most interesting to me is that system's different on every farm.
Yes.
Soils change, management changes, genetics of the livestock are different on every farm. Yeah. What's so fun for me is I have these little epiphanies all the time. It from when I made the decision, to change the way I was farming and go organic was just a simple act of putting pesticides and herbicides in the basement. And my oldest daughter was born in the fall, and was putting that in the basement. Was thinking, next year she'll be mobile, and I can't have these poisons. First time it occurred to me, I was putting poison on the food that, and that what my production was food, and I was putting poison on it. And it's just curious to me. I was probably in my mid-20s and never realized what I was actually doing. And another one that, there's been so many, but I just want to hit on a couple because for me personally, they're interesting. I have a very close friend, Carl Delafield, owns Prairie Creek Seeds, and we were messing around with trying to find the proper species to mix together in a pasture or forage mix. And so Carl came up with this mix, and we planted it on some farms in our county, and we were doing a pasture walk on a Polish farm just north of Sturgeon Bay. And I was walking through the pasture, and Carl Delafield and a bunch of experts were there, along with some of our expert farmers. And I noticed, where there was more diversity in an area of the pasture, there was no rust on the orchard grass. And I noticed it, and I'd walk a little further, and I'd see it again, So I started talking to Carl Delafield. Carl says, well, absolutely. Every plant root brings up different elements, and with them mobilizing it, most likely what was going on was the orchard grass was picking up more nutrients, and then it didn't rust, So another small epiphany on the diversity, the system, and I've just seen these things so many times, so I have these little mini epiphanies all the time, and being 56 now and involved in agriculture my entire life, and it seems to me like it's picking up more momentum rather than the other way around.
Right.
So, Guy, you're saying it makes you happy, or you're happiest when you're learning. Yeah. I think that is at the root of why people farm. Because if you do pay attention and you are aware and part of the system, it's just absolutely fascinating.
Right.
And I think with commodity agriculture, the realization or the understanding that you're producing food for people is lost. Because you find the problem and you kill it. And like you said, monoculture is kind of king in the U.S. And what we're missing out is, just like you said, that diversity. You're fixing a rusting problem by doing nothing except putting more different species out there. How cool is that? You don't have to buy something. You don't have to buy a spray or something to put on there. nature is healing itself.
Mimicking nature. You don't see, in nature, you don't see single species.
Right.
Nature will put there what needs to be there. And so it's just so fun to be able to work with inside those parameters and then be successful. Yeah. It really is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I really do think we're, as far as all that what is causing that to happen, we're at the very tip of the iceberg on understanding all those interconnected relationships, whether it's with the roots and preventing rust, or whether it's with, I'm not coming up with another good example, but just all the different ways that things are interconnected that we don't have any idea how it works. But just being human, that's just who we are. We want to, like you said, we want to be in control. And the more willing you are to just let those things play out, and I guess it would be a belief that it will take care of itself, the more successful you're going to be.
Yeah, it is. It's more than that, because it's really, I'm thinking about this example Kevin gave, because I was there that day, and it was really interesting because they planted, we went to at least a dozen different fields that day that were planted with the same seed mixture, and the seed mixture had over 20, 25, maybe 30 species in it. And the interesting thing was every field with the same seed mix looked totally different. And so that brings you back to the soil-plant relationship, because each piece of ground had its own personality that expressed a different seed mixture, a different mixture. Some were heavy in legumes, some were heavy in grasses. But you didn't put all your eggs in one basket with that diversity issue, and then the interplay. But it's not just a belief, because it's an observation, and you watch closely and you experiment. And you're right about us wanting to understand. We don't have to understand all the mechanisms. We don't have to. We can be thankful that it works that way, and we can. I think part of it is just being in awe. And what's wrong with mystery? What's really wrong with that? I mean, yeah, we don't want to go back to superstition and doing things that just, that have no explanation. But I think there's really something about being really in rhythm with nature and really watching and having that interplay. So it can be more than just a belief system. It can be an active interplay between. Jerry Burnett used to talk about the dance, that it's all about the dance, and he would take it to different levels. He'd talk about the dance, because Jerry was really into phytonutrients and all these chemicals that plants make that are pharmaceutical, and he'd talk about different trace minerals and enzymes, and he'd talk about the dance at that level. But it's also the dance at what you talk about, the rust with the different species, and it's also the cattle and the people and the better fatty acids in the milk. And so, but in all those cases, just like when you're dancing, you don't just grab your dance partner and jerk them around. You anticipate, there's a fluidity to it. You really lose a lot of the thought process. It's more of a fluid doing. And I think that's where we have to go to, is more, like you said in the beginning, awareness, consciousness. That's so important.
Yeah. You hit on the fatty acid in the omega-3 fatty acid in milk. Are there any studies out there that show the fatty acid levels moving because of like a diversity in pasture? I mean, you would think the more diversity is in the grass that a cow would eat, that should affect the milk in a positive way, because they are getting so many different nutrients versus grazing a pure alfalfa field.
Yeah.
So are there any studies on the diversity of pasture and the correlation to the fatty acids?
Not specifically that I'm aware of. I mean, that whole idea makes sense. And the things we do know are that we can just think of it in the simple terms of lush green forage brings more omega-3. And so probably the expert that I'm aware of the most is Heather Darby at the University of Vermont, because Heather Darby is an agronomist that works a lot with different forages, and she's actually looked at the omega-3 content in the forages, which somewhat is reflected in the milk, because you take in a high level omega-3, it passes through in the milk. But the cow is not just an active pass-through. The cow is metabolizing things, and so there's also fatty acids that are built from scratch in the udder and things like that. So it becomes a complicated picture again, But I would support what you say. I think a diverse pasture would be better. But we know, one thing we do know is that a higher forage diet makes the big difference. That's where the real difference is. We did a study ourselves years back, and it made us realize that we're not researchers, because it was painful to try and get samples every month from these 9 farms across the country. And now I understand why researchers go to a university at one place and they don't try to coordinate a research trial across the country. But we did it, and one of the really cool things that came out of there was that there was a straight line relationship between grain feeding and omega-6. And omega-6 by itself drives the omega-6 to 3 ratio. So basically, the more grain you feed, the higher your omega-6 to 3 ratio is, which is less desirable. We know the American diet is too high in omega-6 to 3 ratio. The American diet is 20 parts, 10, 15, 20, 30 parts to 1, and it really should be 3 to 1 or 2 to 1. And so that grain, that was a really neat thing when we laid down our data on a line, and the grain feeding, every pound of grain you fed the omega-6, which drove the omega-6 to 3 ratio up in a straight line fashion. And so it's all about high forage diet. And so omegas are really the tip of the iceberg. And so omega CLA, Jerry Brunetti, again, he used to talk about all these terpenes and alkaloids and all these phyto. We know that healthy food has color to it. So, for humans, when you eat like beets and things, the anthocyanin, that's a healthy. The lycopenes in tomatoes, color in food is usually pigments, which is really healthy things for you, antioxidants and things like that. So it's a real it can be a really technical topic, but on the other side, some of it's very common sense. And so I don't want people to get too lost in chasing. I personally wouldn't want to get too heavy into chasing the science. I know one time somebody asked, what is it? What is it about the grazing that makes the milk better? What is it? Is it the omegas? Is it the CLAs? What is it? Is it the magic? And it is in part the magic, because we're not going to find all the things that are there. And that's what you talked about, awareness in the beginning. When you go out and you go on a pasture walk and it's well managed, and you go to that new paddock and you put those cows in on that beautiful lush forage, you can feel the energy. You know how good that feed is, and it just, it's going to come through in the milk. And so do you really need the science for that? I mean, ultimately it comes down to when that moment, that moment of, the marketing people talk about the moment of truth at the case when they select the product, but really the moment of truth is when they put it in their mouth. That's the moment of truth, and that's what's going to come through when you have all this, this pasture-based, all this health, all these health, and you can talk about all the chemicals and everything, but it just tastes better,
And when you see those cows going into a fresh paddock, and if you're just quiet and you just listen to 50 cows munching on grass, I guess I never really listened to it, because I grew up on a dairy farm, until one of our salespeople, Fran Ayala, lives in Columbus, Ohio, came up and wanted to visit some farms. So I took him to my brother-in-law's farm, and he had just turned the Jerseys into fresh paddock. And we're standing there watching. She goes, "That's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." I'm like, well, maybe I should listen. And so I listened, and it was really, really cool. And, you mentioned the science on that grazing part, but what's not measured is just the exercise of the cow, the sunshine on the cow.
Right.
We're worried about what the cow's eating.
Yeah.
Well, if the cow's sitting on the couch all day long watching TV, eating Cheetos, she's probably not going to be healthy. Just the walk out to pasture and the vitamin D from the sun, everything it's the whole approach.
Yep.
It is not just the feed. It is not just the exercise. It's just the whole system.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly what it is. We covered a lot of ground when it comes to milk nutrition, but the same stands true for the meat. But it's the diversity, it's the quality of the soil, it's the diversity of the pasture. Every plant brings something different to the table. It's the animal eating it, the animal being more healthy. It's not only the omegas and the CLAs, but it's also all the micronutrients that cow picks up. And I like the analogy of the cow laying on the couch eating Cheetos, because it's kind of being a dairyman. The cows in confinement being fed at a bunk. That's where my mind goes right away. But I mean, most people aren't going to do that because they're not dairy people. Mm-hmm. But it's just interesting, and you can look at a grazing cow or grazing or organic cow more like an athlete. They're in better physical condition. They get exercise. They're out in the sun. They're eating a balanced diet. That on soil that's cared for properly. I mean, you can go on and on. So to your point, Dr. Guy, I know for sure you and I aren't going to live long enough to see this. Someday they may be able to analyze all the benefits, but they go way, way, way beyond anything that we've measured to this point.
Well, and that's kind of what I meant by a belief system earlier, whether it's a belief system or just an observation. And it's just I don't need to know. It's what you said. It's the moment of truth when you taste that product, and it just tastes right.
Right.
And whether it's a homegrown tomato, or a milk off the shelf from whatever company, you can tell right away. And I don't need to know all the science that makes it better for me. If it tastes right, that probably means it's going to be good for me. And it's no different with the cows that we're talking about here too. If you do what is the right thing for them, because I guess one of the things we haven't even touched on is that, I don't know if we'll even get into grass milk at all, but a cow wasn't meant to eat grain. And so that probably is part of the reason why that these omega-6 to 3 ratios are changing, and it's, and we know we're not supposed to have those levels. Well, that cow wasn't meant to have that grain in her diet anyway. So the high forage diet, we don't necessarily need to know all the science about what makes that the right thing. We can see it. We can see it, and we can, again, a belief system or just an observation, we see it all the time.
Yeah, what a great example, the fresh tomato. That's the one that, here we are in the dead of winter, and when's the last time you had a good tomato, and so you just know it when you taste it. I want to go back to what Mike said about watching the cows eat, and not watching but listening and taking that in, because we do a lot of marketing tours where we bring people, consumers, mostly buyers that are interested in our products out, and we want to show them what's different. And we take them to a pasture and bring cows into a paddock, and it's really an interesting time when they got, people that haven't been around cows a lot are amazed at the size of the cows and how docile they are, how close you can get to them without, when they're comfortable, that they can be that big of an animal that close to you and not be excited. And they're so focused on the grass, they're munching that grass. And so we've often said, in prep for the tour, when we get to this point, what we really want to do is let the cows do the talking. And it's not just the talking is the munching, and it's the best thing that happens at that point, if you're lucky, and people aren't too deep into looking at their cell phones, or trying to take pictures with their cell phones, is they focus in and they're in awe, like you said, like you said with the thing with Fran, where you just hear that munching, and it's the most beautiful thing. And what that's all about is presence. Is that all of a sudden these people are present, where they've been scattered and their whole life is running and trying to sell things and trying to do the next thing and get their kids to the next game or whatever. And all of a sudden they lose themselves because they're so present in what's going on, and they're so in awe of that cow and that sound. And I think that's part of our magic of organic farming. And I think that's the beauty of the people we get to work with, is so many of them are so present. When we go to their farms, they're focused on what they're doing. Yeah, some of them are busy and they're on the phone with somebody or whatever, but a lot of times we have these conversations that are so the people are there. We're not worried about what's going to happen the next hour or whatever, and that's what it's all about. It's about being in that moment.
And the whole system, like if you just take the time to appreciate and look at how the whole system works. Like for me, it's really exciting to not know why everything works. Because as soon as you actually understand how everything works, it takes the miracle or the excitement about it kind of kills it for me. I just think it's so neat that I don't know why, but the diverse pasture and the cows are into it. When you look at the 4-H test, might not be as good as your straight alfalfa, yet the cows do so much better on it.
Yeah.
I don't need to know why. I just know it is. And I think it's just really neat that, like you said, it's magic.
Yeah.
And we don't need to know everything.
Wayne Dyer is an author that's written a lot of self-help books, and it's kind of like a franchise, and I don't care for that so much. But Wayne Dyer, somebody recommended for me to read one of his books, and I looked through Wayne Dyer's books, and I found this book that wasn't the one recommended, but I bought it, and it's called Real Magic. And I would say that is a book that if you're interested in anything, these thoughts that we're talking about right now, he talks about real magic. So magic kind of has a negative connotation because magic can be, just taken in a dark way, and then it can be used for bad purposes. But he talks about real magic. And so real magic is when, things happen. We talked about how things just happen that, you're surprised and they come out in a good way, or little things that affect things that you don't know until down the line. All those things are real magic. And you can be a really logical, skeptical person and never experience real magic because you won't. But if you just let it go, just let go of your inhibitions a little bit and look at positive things, you will have real magic in your life. It will really happen.
That's really interesting right there, because I am Mr. Skeptic. and I sometimes think that I just ruin a lot of things for myself by being the skeptic. But I want to touch on one thing that's a little bit off topic, but last night on the way to dinner, we were talking about how I think the asparagus that I grow, the tomatoes that I grow, the sweet corn, the beef that I raise, the chicken that I raise, the fish that I catch. I'm not sure if the fish that I catch ties in, but it has without a doubt the best flavor of any of those products that I've ever had. And I think it's because I'm either working with it and we're on the same energy, the same wavelength, whatever, or is it just strictly in my head that I know that I worked this hard at it and now I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor? But why is it that I don't think my asparagus or the beef that I raise is going to taste nearly as good for you as it does for me? Because I think my steaks are the best steaks ever. And you probably would disagree. But is there a real energy connection there? Or is it just, how hard you work to me, so in my head this stuff is going to be great?
Is that not a connection?
Well, it is a connection, but I'm saying...
The other thing is, does it really matter? Does it matter how you get there? I mean, the fact is the experience is that intense and it's that real. And so,
Quit wondering about it.
I mean, right? So is it just your imagination run wild? Is it the placebo effect? So what? If it works, but you could say if somebody's delusional, and that it doesn't really work.
Called that.
But no, I think, Mike, we have it's the chance we could lose some folks here because we start talking about energy and things like that. But really, energy is the basis of all life and all interactions. And so I think you're onto something, that your energy is reflected in the thing that you grow with your hand. I think that really is true, that, people that prune an orchard and grow, grow grapes or whatever, or even plant the seeds for carrots and weed them or whatever. I think there's a reality to that, and I was just had kind of a random thought that maybe doesn't apply totally, but I was just thinking about how in Native American legend, when people were hunters, of course we all as humans, we were hunter-gatherers before we were farmers. One of the things when a native, and it goes through the Inuits or the woodland Indians or any of them, is when they made a kill, one of the things they did was thank the Great Spirit for bringing the animal to them. And so there was this connection. And I got to say that I'm a deer hunter, and I hadn't shot a deer for several years, and I did, get one this year. And I got to say that it really, the reality seemed to me that it wasn't just that I was smart or that it was just lucky or whatever. It just, there was a need to be thankful, and that deer came and presented itself at that time. And it, like you say, it's the best tasting venison ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because I think that goes back, like being thankful for that deer, like you giving thanks for that happening.
Yes.
The appreciation of it means that you're present, that you are understanding that this is way bigger than me.
Yes.
The universe kind of came together in that moment, and just appreciating the fact that this is really happening in our busy life is really, really easy to forget. And you look toward the next thing. But that's something that I've been striving on, and Kevin, I've talked to you about this before, how I need to be in this moment and I need to appreciate what we have. And I think we work in the perfect field to do this on a regular basis, because there's so much exciting thing. And I think wherever you are in the path of your life, you should be present and enjoy the journey. But I think especially for the work that we all do, we really need to appreciate and absorb this journey, because it's pretty cool and we get paid. I mean, how crazy is that?
Well, and I think we're also working with people that you mentioned that the food that you grow yourself, you can feel that it tastes the best. And we're working with farmers that are doing this on a daily basis. And they have to have that connection. And you talk to people that don't work or say they work in an office 9 to 5. And then they're a deer hunter, or they take a trip out west, or and they get back to the land, or they get back in tune with whatever that energy is that comes with breaking away from those daily stresses. And we work with people that do that every day because they have to, and because they get that same feeling that you get when you grow your homegrown tomato or homegrown asparagus. So learning from them it's a privilege. It really is.
Yeah, I think everything we're talking about here is relevant and it's accurate, but to pull it back to the other side for a little bit, Dr. Guy mentioned, earlier on, about your principles on feeding a cow a high forage diet, for example. There are a lot of other areas in managing a farm that they operate under principles as well. I have many conversations with farmers that feel like they need somebody to tell them what to do, and in many cases they do, whether it's agronomy or nutrition for the herd, making sure they're mixing the right feeds, but basic principles of doing no harm to the land, what you cannot use, so on. I often tell farmers, you don't need to know everything, but you need to know something about these things. So what happens when you get an industry like this that has been growing so fast, and there's a considerable amount of money involved here, and people wanting to sell things to you, knowing some simple principles about soils, negative charged fertilizers or elements leach, so they need to be addressed.
Right.
What are the proper parameters We hear people talk about soil balance. I believe it's different on every farm. Fertility, the egg industry, if you go down that path, you should have high fertility. It's not been my experience. Medium fertility grows the best feed, and I think it's because there's more balance there. If any element is out of whack, it affects the plant. If chemistry, there's principles too. We know there's interactions between different. A common one would be magnesium and calcium. Mm-hmm. So there's some fundamental things, and I don't think it's over the head of most farmers. If you pay attention, it's as simple as the principle as the high forage diet. But you have to know some things about nutrients in the soils, nutrients going into a cow's ration. You don't have to know it all, but you have to know enough to know you're doing the right thing, or at least have have a good idea that you're going down the right path. So it is. I really believe it is the connection between the human, the soil, the animal, the plant, and they all tie together. But at the same time, it just doesn't happen on its own either. You have to adhere to some principles, and you have to know some things and know some things about relationships. To pull it all together.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think you're talking something about advising farmers and farmers, salesmanship to farmers and all that sort of thing. And to me, it's like, what level of analytics are you going to go to? And I think, one of the sayings I like to think about is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if something's working, I'm less inclined to be real analytical about, what's all the specifics are down to a detailed level. But you're right. If things aren't working, then soil analysis, feed analysis, those things are really helpful. There's no doubt about that. That's important. But I think one of the ways I want to go back to what Mike was talking about in the great privilege we have to see these beautiful places and be there in that moment. Well, I think one of the ways we can help farmers is to make them realize how lucky they are, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get caught up in their busyness and they don't see it. And one of the things I've seen is that Organic Valley farms are in the most beautiful places in every state that they're in. So if you go to any state that we're in and some of our farms that you go to, they're the most magnificent places you can go to in those states. And so these guys are living in the most beautiful places around. And the other thing about it that we should probably capitalize from a marketing perspective is all the people that are in urban areas surrounding those regions go to those areas where those forests, where those lakes, where those rivers, those oceans, they go there for recreation. And to think about that, Organic Valley farmers are preserving that and making that environment even better, that there's going to be there for their recreation in the future. I think just about water, and just think about how our farms protect the streams and the lakes and the ocean. That's something that I think we should capitalize on. That message is that look at these farms in these areas where you like to go. I mean, I'm thinking about the Pacific Northwest, I'm thinking about New England, I'm thinking about all these, the Appalachians, we have farms in just incredible places. And sometimes we have to tell that farmer that, hey man, stop, just look out there, look over that ridge, look at that sunset, look at that, and because they're worried about what you got to do and everything. And we all have to plan, we all have to do that, but we've got to stop and take that moment to smell the roses too.
Because some of the places where these farms are, that's where they live, that's where they work, so they can't see the forest because of the trees.
Yeah.
And, some of these farms that, that I work with, I grew up in the area that I work in, Central Ohio, and I don't appreciate what we have there until, I was in Scandinavia for 2 weeks this summer, and when I got home, never in my life did I realize how beautiful that area was. And I think we can, as the pollinators for farmers, we can help them appreciate and let them know how much we appreciate them for what they're doing, and try to be of service to them, and try to encourage them to, they're really doing the hard work. I feel like I'm riding coattails. Hopefully I'm of some service to them.
Right.
But they're the ones doing the real work. You know, when they get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to milk, yeah, I'm not up. I'm not planning to either.
Mm-hmm. Having lived both lives, I agree with you 100%. We are very fortunate. Mm-hmm. I have done both. Mm-hmm. And I think this well, I was about to say this is more rewarding, but that's not really true. It's probably very equal. But the advantage to what we do, you know, within the co-op, is we get to touch so many more people. When you're on your farm, let me put it this way: when you're on that, when I was on the farm making those decisions on how things got done, I believe was more important. But at that time, now being able to help connect the dots, like you said earlier, Mike and Brian, about pointing out something that you saw on one farm that may really help, you know, a producer you're working with now. And it's perhaps it's just as important, just in a different way, because if I'm really stumbling here because my mind keeps going back and forth between the two lives, you know, and I guess I would have to say it's equally as important, because I wouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't done the first part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's quite an honor to share that experience with a lot of people, and then to learn from everyone. You know, I always tell you guys and the rest of the staff, you know, even a farmer that doesn't farm that well can teach you something.
Yes.
You know, they do something well.
Yes.
And then, you know, there's your rare producer that you know does everything well, but they probably wouldn't agree with that if you told them up front, you know. But it's just the perception. Mm-hmm. But it really is an honor. It was an honor to do it on the farm, and now it was an honor to work with the farmers, and now it's really an honor to work with the staff that works with the farmers, and hire new people and share the experience and stuff. It's just hard to describe. It's just really gratifying.
Mm-hmm. That actually means a lot, because for people who don't know, Kevin is Brian and I's boss. And he just said it's an honor working with us.
You're getting this documented, aren't you?
This is documented. I will be using this. But I could not agree more, Kevin. You know, it's I think growing up on a dairy farm, I have really, really learned a lot the last 6 years in what I did wrong on the farm. But it's a whole. You know, I get to help 110 Organic Valley members in Central Ohio from one position, okay? If I can only impact a couple or help a couple of them, I at least help a couple of them. But we have such a reach that hopefully we can be those pollinators to really help these farmers flourish for the next generation. And make the soil better, make the animals better, and the end product better.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean the magnitudes. You know, I don't think about it often because I don't think it does any good to dwell on these things. But there are 997 members. You know, through the staff I work with. You know, to have even influence in some small level with that many farms across, I think it's 14 states. It's just astonishing, you know, to be here. Mm-hmm. You know, it just really is.
Well, I think it ties in with the idea of community, and I think that's one thing I'd like to cover before we're finished here is the importance of community. And you know, here we are at the Northeast Indiana Grazing Conference, and we see this very strong community of farmers, grazing farmers, plain folks, and other farmers. And it's really striking just driving through this countryside, because you have these small farms, one on top of the other. You have buggies going up and down the highway, going through the busy intersections, you know, horses waiting for a stoplight. It's just something that most people just don't get to see that. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and here we have all these, we were working the booth today, and all these farmers are talking to us and asking about the future and asking about where things are at. And they all did their chores this morning. They're all home doing their chores now. And we're part of that community. We're part, and you mentioned the reach of the group and everything, but now widen it out to the whole co-op, widen it out to all the farmers, and the work with international farmers. We know farmers are the same the world throughout, and I think that's the hope for humanity, is learning how to cooperate better. And I think we're a model of that, and we learn from each other, and we learn from the plain community so much about cooperating. And I think that's really critical going forward for everyone. And the other thing is to realize we're all in this together. We're all in this together.
Mm-hmm. And just one thing to tie it back to one of the videos we mentioned earlier, the 100,000 beating hearts. And, you mentioned going through the small town and how, that farm and that is helping to build that community back up. And you also mentioned we're here in northern Indiana amongst the LaGrange County Amish community, and you mentioned the organic community, but also just the living community around here and how it's thriving because of the small farm.
Yep.
And just seeing that happen, coming from the outside, Mike, you grew up in an Amish community, and I came from the outside. And being able to see how a real community works, it's something that you want to see modeled all over the place. And I don't think it can be done without farms.
Yeah.
And that's what the exciting part is about working in the organic industry is, it may not be the only way to hold on to that community, but right now that certainly looks like the only viable alternative for farming and to keep a small farm in business. And that's what I think keeps, this keeps this whole wheel moving.
Yes.
So, yeah. Any final thoughts? And then I think we'll wrap her up.
Well, we shared some quotes. So I'll just share one, whether it's people that work with farmers, like we do, and help them transition, or if it's farmers listening to this, or just somebody that's interested in the podcast and the content that you guys have been covering. And if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So it's just, you never give up. You just don't know what's around the corner. You don't know when you're going to affect someone with the smallest thing. But if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
No, I just want to really thank both of you for sitting down with us tonight. I really appreciate this. I love going down rabbit trails, and I think we jumped quite a few.
Covered a lot of them.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.